have faith in God is not a stagnant state, it's a journey. As believers, we should grow in our knowledge of God and His Word. Walk with Alan Cutting and many other believers as we walk the believer's journey.
Aloha, and thank you again for joining us here on the believer's journey. I want to thank everyone who prays for us, who subscribes to our station, and if you don't, I hope that you do, and who watches our video, who shares our video. I want to thank our sponsors, Guerrero CPA, Guerrero Law, and the Trade Show Displays, and all of you who just really support our program. We really do feel blessed by you and honored, and we hope to help our ministry grow. The more we grow, we can come out and speak at your churches or events and so forth. So I just want to put a little plug in for that. And today we're going to continue with our family dynamics series we've been talking about. And we're going to talk about today relationships of control and abuse. And today my guest, I know her intimately. And she's, probably, I would think she's kind of an authority on the receiving end of things, and she's done really well on the other side. So it's a good thing to have my wife, Susan Cutting, here.
Hi, everybody.
So Susan, was born and she was raised in Hawaii. For those of you who don't know, and she was there most of her life, growing up, went to college there and everything. And she was someone who lived in a very controlling atmosphere as a child, and then she married somebody who was somewhat like her dad, I guess, a person who was very controlling. And from there, she has other stories. And so we're going to listen to Susan's testimony and her story, and we're going to go from there. And I hope you learned something from this, and I really pray that this goes well. So I know this is not an easy topic. I know this is not an easy subject. I do feel there's victory in this area, and I just want to let you know that up front. And Susan, hello.
Well, as Alan said, I was born and raised in Hawaii, and it was just my twin sister and myself with my parents.
So let me ask you a question. So are you the good twin or the evil twin?
Depends on which one you ask. So growing up, my Dad worked very long hours. He worked double shifts. He worked for his father. And so he was very seldom at home because of that, as well as on the weekends. Usually he played golf Saturdays and Sundays. Occasionally he would take a Sunday off and spend time with the family, but he was not really around very often. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom. Back then, to try and work and find childcare was difficult, and there were no relatives who were able to do childcare. And so my mom also didn't drive, so if we needed to go somewhere, we had to take a taxi or ride the bus. So there was not a whole lot of freedom to be able to go out. And my dad was the traditional type of dad from that era. He was the breadwinner. He handled all the finances. He just took care of everything. And my mom was the typical homemaker, stayed at home, did the cooking, the cleaning, and all the usual things related to that. My dad did more or less control my mom to the extent that if she wanted to go shopping or spend money, he would give her a set amount of cash. She did not have a driver's license, so she had no identification to be able to do checks. And it wasn't until many years later that she got a credit card and was able to do that. So she was very limited in what she was able to do financially. And then my parents were very strict with my sister and me. We were really not allowed to do much of anything. We weren't allowed to sleep over at someone's house. We weren't allowed to roller skate, ride bicycles, or do any activities because we might get hurt. When we were in high school, we still were forced to swim in the shallow end of the swimming pool. And even though we knew how to swim, so there wasn't a whole lot of freedom. Even up until we were in college, we weren't allowed to drive, even though we had gotten driver's licenses. We weren't allowed to leave the house or take a bus or go anywhere by ourselves. Although if a friend was available with a car, then that was usually okay. So it was very restrictive. There wasn't a lot of freedom.
Well, even from what I know in your stories, so like, let's say at night, if you were at a high school homecoming or prom night or something like that, didn't you have restrictions on coming home early or so forth?
On the weekends, if there was an event at the school, which we lived 2 blocks away from the school, we were allowed to go, but we did have a curfew of like 10 or 11. The only time there was a real issue was the night of the senior prom, because our graduation was the very next day, and I was with a group that was going to a show that was supposed to start about 9 o'clock and would have ended about 10, but when I called to say I was going to be going to the show, where we'd actually gone down to Waikiki to go to the show, I was told I had to come home immediately, and so that ruined the plans for everybody.
So did you have like early curfews? Bedtime.
Oh, well, yes, growing up until maybe middle school age, it was 7:30 or 8 o'clock. I think by high school it was 9 o'clock was allowed. So, yeah, it was kind of different.
Boy, when I was in high school, I was up till midnight, 1 o'clock. Of course, I had no parent to watch over me, but it was late.
Well, after high school, I was able to stay out later.
Okay. Now, do you feel like, we talked about this a little bit, do you feel like you or your sister might have been singled out to be picked on more than the other?
You mean one of us versus the other?
Yes.
It's hard to say, actually, while we were growing up, because I think it probably seemed to each of us that one had more privileges than the other from time to time. I do know that there were times when, if I was invited somewhere, I was told I couldn't go unless my sister came too, even if she had not been invited by that person. However, she was able to go places without me being told to go along with her. So, but I don't know what her perspective would be. It might be similar.
So with such a restrictive guidelines, were you and your sister bad girls? Did you get in trouble all the time?
No. Actually, because I always obeyed my parents completely. I never rebelled. If they told me to do something, I always did it.
Have you ever been spanked?
Yes, but I never knew why.
That's kind of typical with a lot of parents. They get angry and they spank without.
Well, my mom's method of spanking was the usual method in Hawaii, which is the rubber slipper, which doesn't do anything but make a slight sting or something. It wasn't anything bad.
But your parents weren't like physically abusive, where they would hit you, slap you, knock you across the room?
No, never. No, and I never remember them yelling or raising their voices or anything. And I never heard them arguing or anything. If they did so, it was not in front of us. It's just they were very strict with what we were allowed to do or not allowed to do. And I do remember questioning my mother because she would talk about all the things she did when she was in high school, the parties she was able to go to, and the friends that she hung out with. And I said, well, how come you were able to do that and you don't allow us to do similar things? And so she said, well, that was a different time when it was safe. It's not safe now. So she was very fearful.
And even your dad, I know a lot of his stories. I mean, he went out to the beach, to the water, to fish, to surf, to go crabbing, all these things as a kid.
Well, his dad was more of an outdoor person, and so he encouraged that. And my dad took up golfing with my grandfather at an early age, starting when he was about 7 years old on Kauai. And so I think as the boy in his family, he had more freedom than probably his sister did.
Okay. So in your family growing up, you can say your parents weren't physically abusive, but they're very controlling.
Yeah, they were just controlling us to. My dad was controlling with money. My mom primarily was controlling of what we were allowed to do or not. And so when we were 10 years old and we were visiting family in Florida, we met a girl down the street from one of my relatives, and so through her family we learned how to ride bikes. It was the only way we would have had that opportunity otherwise.
So out of all that, with the fear of your mom, and I don't know how much your dad, because it doesn't really, going into your family from the outside looking in, you can't see how much your dad had input in any kind of fear factor or strictness. So, but coming out of that situation, how did that make you become as a person with the idea of fear of things?
Well, I don't think at that time I was fearful. I was probably just resentful that I wasn't able to do things with friends or be able to attend activities. But I wasn't afraid at that point. It was just being controlled.
So you're afraid of losing money?
Well, yeah.
Are you afraid of heights?
Oh, well, yeah, there's a story about that. My dad thought it would be fun when we were saying goodbye to some friends who were sailing on one of the passenger ships back then. I believe it was the Lurline. And he lifted us up and held us over the railing. And it was a really long way down. And then he also enjoyed on the Ferris wheel tipping the seat. So that probably started my uncomfortable feelings about height.
So I guess what I'm trying to look at and get at is looking at your mom with all the fears you just said that she had, a fear of you getting hurt or fear of all these things. In fact, I think you've told me that she wouldn't even let you do chores around the house.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, we were not allowed to do any chores, no cleaning, no cooking. We weren't allowed to do anything, and never learned how to do laundry. So my first opportunity to do that when I was in college was interesting. I didn't know you weren't supposed to just pour the bleach directly on the clothes. So a little experience in practice back then would have been helpful. I would have learned some skills that, are very necessary when you're out on your own.
So do you see where maybe your mom's fear maybe transferred or rubbed off on you a lot?
I don't know.
Ever thought about it?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
I just know that there were things that would have been beneficial had I been able to do it, to get the social skills or just skills that you need when you move out on your own. So I had to learn everything later.
Okay. And they even, well, I should say they, or because it's hard to tell when your mom says something how much behind your mom, or your dad says something behind your dad, their spouse is behind them telling them, and you don't know that your dad might be saying something because you're seeing your mom and your dad. So, for example, they controlled who you dated.
Well, that's true. My mom was rather particular about that. And even in college, if someone asked me out, if she didn't think it was appropriate, I was not allowed to go out.
What would appropriate mean?
I don't really know what her criteria was, because there was one time someone who had graduated from my high school but was a couple years older, so I never knew him, asked me out. He was in my French class, and she said, well, you don't know who he is. And I said, well, he graduated from Punahou just like we did, and we know some people in common. But because she wasn't willing to meet him, she said I couldn't go out.
Okay, so it's pretty common when we are brought up in with our parents that we have, that a lot of guys end up getting married to women who are like their mothers, and a lot of women, girls, end up getting married to men like their fathers. So you had a very controlling father.
He was more financially controlling. I don't know how much he was controlling as far as some of the rules for other things. I wasn't able to discern back then.
Well, even controlling to your mother.
That, yes.
Okay, so that's what you knew in a couple was how the relationship goes, is that the husband is controlling the wife, and that's how it's supposed to be. That's kind of what you knew.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, so you ended up getting married at
19
years old, and was he controlling?
Not in the beginning, not that I was aware of. It evolved over time. So I would say it was probably somewhere after over 5 years that little things started becoming evident.
Okay. Did you notice if your sister married somebody controlling?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
That was obvious from the beginning.
Yeah.
He showed his true colors right from the get-go.
So here you are, you come from a controlling atmosphere as a child, and you marry into a controlling atmosphere. You may not have seen it in the beginning, but it was probably there, just not obvious.
It wasn't obvious to me.
Okay. But it turned into a more controlling situation, environment, and maybe even 5 years later, as you had your first child, did it become abusive?
Right. He had been wanting to start a family, and then he was accusing me of not wanting to have a family. And I said, well, that wasn't true. And so after our son was born, then he realized that there were some inconveniences with children, such as you can't just go anywhere whenever you want because you have to consider the child, and you might have to have child care, or what if the child is sick, and he didn't like that inconvenience. And so I think at that point he realized that having kids was more of a millstone around his neck than what he had envisioned.
So you decided to have another one.
Well, yes. And he had a hard time dealing with having children. He didn't have the patience. He didn't understand them. And there were times where he resented them just because, we maybe couldn't get a babysitter, and so we couldn't do the things that we could have done beforehand.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the control part of this, because when you're a graduate from University of Hawaii, correct? You have your Bachelor of Arts. And when did you get your degree?
Well, when we got married, when I was 19, I had finished my sophomore year in college, but then he was in the military, so we were in Germany for 3 years. And I did continue taking classes through the University of Maryland. I was a registrar for University of Maryland at an Army education center. And then when we were transferred back to Hawaii, I went back and finished my degree in 1.5 years. So,
okay. And then, so then you wanted to get your master's degree.
yes, I wanted to get my master's degree, but he said no, because he was getting his master's degree, which was a requirement of the position he had in the military. He was worked in medical administration, sort of like hospital administration, and that was a priority. So he had the master's degree that he worked on, but then I never had that opportunity.
Okay, so he said because he was getting his master's degree, so now that he gets his master's degree, now it's time for you to get your master's degree. What happened?
He said no, and then we had the kids.
Okay. So it was controlled before the kids came.
Well, in that perspective, yes, because we were still in Hawaii when he was getting his master's degree.
Okay. And, now when you were in Germany, I mean, because I know you and I have gone through things, and a lot of the things that we go through is because of stuff that happened, your second 20 years of life. So for example, you've told me that you were in a car accident in Germany.
Oh.
So this is in the beginning part of your marriage.
Oh, that's right.
And you got hit from behind, but you got in trouble by your husband, correct?
Oh, yeah. He actually went totally ballistic. And I didn't understand that because, I wasn't at fault. I was sitting at a red light. And then, unfortunately, there was another time when the road had a grade downhill. It was cobblestone, it was winter, and there was ice. And I couldn't, even though I wasn't going fast, I couldn't stop without bumping into the vehicle in front of me, which unfortunately was a truck that had a hook on the back of it that caught my grill and tore out the grill. And he went ballistic again. And I didn't understand that reaction.
So, and I'm just going to bring up some incidences because you and I have gone through this, and then, and I could see that you've been abused. I could tell because of my background in counseling and my background in education and all those kind of things I went through. I didn't really want to, but I did. So, for example, something that your sister told me one time is that she didn't think you were really abused. And then her and her husband were staying at our house one time. This is when we were first married. We were living on Amberstone, and you'd taken out some meat and put it out on the counter to defrost, and you left it out too long, and it got ruined, and you got all upset. Now, mind you, this piece of meat was worth, what, $5?
I don't remember.
I do. It was worth $5, and you got all upset, and you threw it in the trash, and you started saying that you needed to be punished, that you did a bad thing, and you ruined the meat, and now you need to be punished, and you asked me to punish you. Now, your sister was there, and she said to me, I never thought Susan was abused until I saw that. And I realized she was abused. So even your sister didn't think, after all those 25 years of through that and hear that she didn't think that until she saw this. And this was an actual reaction that you had that I peg from your past, and probably a combination of your childhood, because a lot of it had to do with money, and your marriage, because a lot of it had to do with punishment with money.
Probably.
So explain some of that, how you feel about those things when they happen, and where are you, even, during this period of time after you've been liberated from the control and abuse?
Well, just because of some of the issues I was trying to work through, especially with regard to being married to my former husband and seeing counselors, I was diagnosed with PTSD, which I struggle with to this day because of the severity of the abuse that I endured.
Okay.
So what happened with the meat, that's a trigger. And triggers cause those kinds of flashbacks and reactions. And it's difficult to deal with.
Now I know, because I live with you.
You do.
And we share the same room. I know that watching you then, and for the first 10 years of our marriage, it was real struggle, because you looked like and acted like you were actually still living in that time frame, in that prison, if you will. I call it a prison.
Well, the last several years when I was married to him were very difficult, because he was not only very verbally abusive, but he was physically abusive as well. One time he picked me up and threw me across the living room almost into the brick fireplace. Another time he kicked me and almost shoved me down the stairs from behind. One time he threw me into a wall. So, but yeah, there was constant verbal abuse.
And I understand he was abusive to your son, but not necessarily your daughter.
No, he never displayed anything towards her. There were times when he was abusive towards our son. He, again, did not understand children, did not understand the different ages and stages and things that they do. So everything irritated and annoyed him. And when he was in the 4th grade, he got really mad at our son, and he hit him in the face with a belt. And so when he went to school, he told him, if anybody asked, tell him he was playing basketball and the ball hit him in the face.
That's typical with people who abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And he would yell a lot.
So he really didn't sound like a very happy person.
No, well, and he also had developed a drinking problem, and I didn't realize he was an alcoholic until just before we went our separate ways. I didn't know he had been hiding a flask of alcohol under the driver's seat of the car. I found out when I stopped one time and it rolled out from under the seat. He hid bottles of alcohol in the garage. I don't know where else. He was probably, the way he measured a drink into a cup, he was probably the equivalent of 8 drinks or more. So that affected his behavior. He was what you would call a nasty drunk.
Okay. Now, even though I brought up about, like, say, that meat, and there are other instances like that with that behavior, I want to put on record here that in the last several years of our marriage, you've done quite well. You seem like you've a lot of these things you've conquered, and some of them you haven't.
Well, some things are difficult. I would say a period that was really difficult for me to deal with was when we were going through our divorce. He decided he would rather be with this other woman who was his drinking buddy. But then, even though he was the one who chose to leave and marry her, he didn't want to pay child support. He didn't want to do anything that would have been his responsibility. And he just made the life, me and the children, a living hell. And to the point when anytime he came to do visitation or anything, I always had to have a law enforcement officer present. And even in the presence of a law enforcement officer, he would be belligerent to the point where one time the deputy had to tell him, say, "Sir, you know, if you don't stop, I will arrest you." And he was just very defiant. And it was a very frightening time for me. And even his attorney liked me and gave me his cell phone number to call him, because he apologized for representing him, because he said had he known what he was like before, he would never have taken him as a client.
So I know that a lot of people hear a lot of stories of, especially women, complaining about their ex-husbands and how it's so terrible, whatever. But I want you to give a story. This story's in particular. You guys were already separated, filing for divorce. You were living in one home. He was in another. You did your taxes on your own. Tell the story about what happened.
Well, even though the divorce wasn't final, you could file your taxes as married but separate. And I thought that was the most advantageous for me, you know. And so when he found out, he threatened me and said,
Wait. He over the phone? What happened? Tell the story.
It was over the phone.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, but he threatened me and told me that I needed to refile the taxes as joint, because he said otherwise he would have to pay taxes, and he didn't want to pay taxes. And if I didn't do that, he was going to kill me.
So I wanted that to be said because I think that it's important that people don't just dismiss these stories. I believe that domestic violence is basically an epidemic. I see it everywhere. I grew up with, abuse, in our home growing up. Most of us kids, we talk about it, how we were abused by our dad and mom and so forth, and my uncle. And so I think it shouldn't always be dismissed, because I think the reality is there's the fear of somebody is different. It may be one thing because you're afraid because somebody yells at you, but it might be a whole different thing if somebody picked you up, threw you against the wall, and said, "I'm going to kill you if you don't do something that I want you to do."
Well, again, I do have PTSD and I do have triggers. And one of the ones that I struggle with is if something happens to a car I'm driving. I mean, it is a very strong trigger. Or if people yell at me, that's very difficult to deal with.
Now, do you yell?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that way.
Susan!
No, I mean, I'm talking about somebody.
I live with you.
I'm talking about somebody who's yelling at you in an extremely abusive manner. I mean, you have no idea what I went through. Absolutely none. It was horrific.
Oh, I believe you.
But that being said, I did choose to forgive him, especially because of our children and grandchildren. And so it was the best thing I could have ever done.
I want to get to that in a second, but I want a couple more things before we jump there, okay? Because there's a couple more things that, as I entered into the picture, there's this little thing I want to talk about. I'm sure you know which one it is.
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. You will. And also, when we got married, there's something you did for the several years into our marriage, and now you don't do it any longer. And that would be every time something happened, you would lie to me.
Well, that's what fear does to people.
But you would lie all the time, afraid of being in trouble. So you lied, and all of a sudden the story didn't make sense. And I realized that's not true. And so finally, after telling you, how can I trust you if you don't tell me the truth all the time?
Well, I was too afraid of what the consequences could be.
And that's because of me, or
No.
because of your past?
My past, because of what happened to me.
Okay.
I was always trying to protect myself at all
Okay.
costs.
And I think, now I've said this before, the way you see things, because you see your dad, you see your ex-husband, you see your sister's husband. What are you laughing for?
I think you're going somewhere.
I am. You know me well. Here are 3 people very controlling, 2 of which you know are abusive. One you don't know if he is or not, or was or not. And this is the way your picture is of husbands.
Well, men in general.
Okay, men in general. Fair. Well, you marry me. Now, do you see controlling? No. Well, say it. Don't
No.
just. Okay. But your reaction to me a lot of times as if I'm going to be controlling. Isn't that true?
Probably. Again, it's a
P.S.
different, yeah. It's very difficult when you've gone through the trauma that I have. And it wasn't just even with my ex-husband. It was with my brother-in-law, with other people. I have suffered verbal and emotional abuse from a multitude of people, which just compounds the experiences I had with him.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I guess with me stepping in, because especially with someone like a brother-in-law or somebody else who's doing something, I'm protecting you. I'm not letting that happen. And so basically, for me, I see some people as bullies, and so I just intelligently decide to counteract, and I don't know, bullies are bullies and they run. I don't know. So
Yeah, but I did endure probably over 25 years of abuse or more.
yeah. So, but like I said, you've come a long way. I mean, when we were first dating and we were first married, I didn't see any signs at all. I would have run for the hills if I did.
Maybe that's a good thing.
And then when it came out, and then it wouldn't stop. It was like flowing over. It was like a waterfall all day, every year.
The plug came out of the dam.
It did. But I've noticed that it's less occurring, and sometimes even better. And and I know that when we first married, you said something about your ex-husband that, what was it? You wish he would die a terrible, horrible death and burn in hell. I think those are your words.
He probably had just done something that triggered that. that was before the forgiveness part.
Because if you remember, I said to you, that's terrible, not because of what you're doing for him, it's because of what's happening in you.
Well, I think at that time that was probably related to something he had just done that hurt the kids.
And I remember he was wanting to come over, and I said, sure, come on over. And you were scared to death.
Yeah, and you invited him in, and I thought you'd lost your mind. Why would you allow him in my home?
I'm not afraid of bullies.
Well, you found out afterwards that he wasn't such a nice guy after all.
Well, that's true, but still, my goal was for you to be free, not whether he can come to my home or not or whatever, because I was going to make sure you were safe and you were free from all that past inside.
Well, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, forgiving him made all the difference.
Yeah. So something I want to bring up on this program, and Susan's done a perfect job with this, is that she said she forgave him and was the best thing she ever did in her life. Now that's huge, because I would think the best thing she ever did in her life would not marry this guy.
Well,
but,
who knew?
Yeah, who knew? But something she said there is really important, because if we're going to be true followers of Jesus, we need to see where we are and where we go forward. And it's admirable. I commend you for the fact that you can sit there and say, I've forgiven my husband. Ex-husband, excuse me. Ex-husband. And it's just not worth it, because you've realized you need to be free. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah, because, it was always so difficult to be around him. And I guess that moment when I realized, I can't go on this way was probably after my granddaughter's second birthday party. And he was being his usual nasty self, and he was going over to my son's house afterwards, and I wanted to go, and my son said, I'm sorry, but Dad doesn't want you there. And so I had to go home. And then afterwards my son realized, well, that was the wrong thing to do, and he told his dad, that's it, never again am I going to allow that. But I realized, well, it's just not worth it anymore, because all it does is hurt me. And, I was with you, and why do I have to be hurt all the time? If I forgive him, then I'm free.
Jesus made a comment in John chapter 8. He said, if the Son sets you free, you are free
indeed.
Indeed. I have watched you grow as a believer in leaps and bounds. I mean, seriously, it's been pretty cool. And I've watched you and listened to you talk to people and watched you grow and watched you try to shed some of this stuff from your past. And for the most part, you're doing a pretty good job. I have to really commend you for what you've been through for 43 years of your life, something like that. It's, but the last 30 years, you've been on your own, and the last 24 years almost, we've been struggling with this, and you've been doing a good job. And I think that, you really do seem like you want to honor Jesus.
I do. And what's really interesting, because since I forgave him, I can attend family gatherings and everything. I have no problem being around him, being around his wife, or anything like that. He still has a problem. He still says terrible things about me to the children. And, it's like, why? Why does he have this? He chose his life. He chose all these things. I had nothing to do with the decisions he made to leave. But when we're all together, say, at my son's house or with my daughter or anything for any kind of gathering with the grandkids, it doesn't bother me at all to be around him. But it still bothers him.
Well, that's why.
So he's not free.
Exactly. And that's where the freedom is within. I'm forgiving somebody, and it is so important because it frees you, because it doesn't, by hating somebody else and wishing harm on somebody else, in your own mind and in your own words, doesn't hurt that other person. It only hurts you.
Right. It's like, you take poison and expect them to die. It doesn't work that way. And actually, what some people find interesting is recently, I was actually trying to help him find a caregiver for his wife who has early onset dementia and needs round-the-clock care. And I contacted people and referred people to try and help him. And it's like, well, that's the right thing to do if you have the ability to help.
Like I said, I'm real proud of you. You've really grown a lot. I may be wrong here, but I have a feeling it might have started your big, huge surge of growth and maybe wisdom probably had to have started when you were able to forgive. What do you think?
I'm sure that was a large part of it, because without that forgiveness, there's always that little something nagging at you all the time, and the resentment and the bitterness, not partly for things that you've lost, but also just for all the hardships that, you've gone through. I went through even, all the years until our children were graduated from college and married. Up until that point, it was still a living hell. And after that, it's like I'm free. And I don't wish any ill will towards him or his wife or anything. And I've seen some changes in him towards our children, where he seems to actually be more interested in their welfare. So maybe, hopefully, something's happening with him. And maybe someday he'll reach that point where maybe he'll accept the Lord and turn his life around, which would be what we would all pray for.
So here we are, looking at your life. There's a few years here. How would you depict yourself today, or in the last few or several years, where you are in your life, in your being, if you will?
Well, I feel the difference that God has made in my life, and the life I've made with you, and all the positives. I still struggle tremendously with triggers, and that is difficult still to overcome, because they can hit out of the blue, and it's a very overwhelming feeling. I don't know how to describe it, but I think that's going to be still something I have to try and deal with. I'm not sure the best way how, because sometimes you're just not really sure. Just certain things, I guess, remind you of a situation in the past that created a lot of fear or something.
So I know that you don't feel totally without fear and totally free from all this. I know you have somewhat of a freedom, but I know you don't feel totally free, correct?
No. It's probably a lifelong struggle.
I know one thing you've always told me, you haven't told me this much recently, but you used to tell me all the time, I just want to feel like I'm loved.
And valued.
Okay.
And because of the various people in my life who were verbally, emotionally, physically abusive to me, it took a toll.
So it might be a good idea for me to take all your credit cards and just give you a monthly allowance?
I don't think so.
Do you feel like now, and I know this is weird for me to ask this question, but I want you to be really honest. Now in your life, now that you're remarried and you're in this relationship, what kind of things do you see for yourself today and for your future? How do you see hope? Do you see like a light at the end of the tunnel? What do you see in your life now being married to me?
Well,
or do you see darkness and gloom?
no. Most of the time, things are fine. It's just when I get these triggers that I can't totally eliminate how I react. It's not a response, it's an unconscious reaction. It's a visceral type of feeling. And it's something that you don't feel like you can control. It's very difficult. But I think I see there's less and less, but sometimes a trigger will take you back to those other times, and I don't know, it's difficult to describe.
So how do you feel, or how do you believe in the phrase I told you just a couple minutes ago about when Jesus said, if you're free, if the Son sets you free, you're free indeed? What does that mean to you? How do you take that?
Well, because, of his sacrifice for us on the cross, we were all forgiven of our sins, and he gave us the roadmap and blueprint to follow, not only follow him in what his word says, but to allow us to live in freedom. And that's really easy to see intellectually and to understand it, to live it every day, all day. It's difficult for people who've been through terrible storms in their life. But that promise is always there.
I've seen you. You've been singing in the choir for 20 some odd years. You're active in your church. You're active with people. I've listened to you counsel other people. Of course, I know a few years ago or several years ago, you counseled somebody about one area, and then that night you're upset with your own self because of something triggers you. And I'm like, wait a minute, you just told that person.
Yeah, it's easy to detach yourself and know the right things to say. To live it is another whole nother thing.
Yeah.
As I said, you've got the intellectual ability and knowledge, but, merging the two together isn't always easy.
Yeah. And a lot of it has to do with the power of the Holy Spirit. The Bible teaches us to be victorious in him. Victorious in our life, victorious in the things that we do, in the things, people who we are, to be victorious. And we get that from the power of the Holy Spirit. We get that because of the sacrifice and love of Jesus. We get that because of the honor and the adoption of the Father. We get this from Scripture. We get this from God. And I believe that regardless of what we've gone through, what you've gone through, and what many, many, many people have gone through or are going through, I do believe there is victory, not just escape, but victory in all this. I think sometimes it may happen instantly, very, very seldom it does. And many times it can happen through time, like it's happening with you, through time. As you process and as things are eliminated from this, triggers empty out. There was an author I read, his name is Reuben Welch, and he talks about how our image of the Father is, and usually our image of the Father is, some great big giant old man with a long beard and a hammer in his hand, ready to squash us or hit us anytime we do something wrong. And that's our image of the Father because of our image of authority. Our parent, our grandparent, or uncle or something, we look at that. And he said in this book he wrote, he said, actually, if we really want a proper image of the Father, we need to look to Jesus. Jesus says, I and the Father are one. And if we see Jesus, we start looking at somebody who shows compassion, somebody who shows love, somebody who shows care, somebody who feeds people because they're hungry, heals them because they're hurting or sick. And if we can do that, all the little slots of the Father in our brain can come out and replaced with the thoughts of what our visual of what Jesus is like, which replaces that of what the Father is like. And I don't know how that relates to you or how that relates to many of you who have been in or are in this kind of a situation. But I think that's a really good way to look at it. I don't know what you think.
I've never visualized God the Father as that controlling disciplinarian type.
Well, you didn't have that because you didn't get spanked with your kid. You just looked at your dad as somebody who was there sometimes.
I mean, I've always looked to Jesus as what I would envision God to be like.
Yeah, which is healthy. But a lot of us grow up with a father who is abusive, who beat you for whatever reason it was. And so our vision of the Father is a little more drastic. And we have to learn about Jesus in order to learn about the Father, because our idea of the Father is totally different. So there's a lot of people out there who have been brought up or who live in a way of abuse from their parent, usually a father or so forth. And so our visual of Father is that. So we grow up with this problem. And some of these men grow up with that mindset and become that to their own spouse and their own children, because they haven't properly, brought it into their mind what they need to be like as Jesus shows us what the Father is like. Pretty interesting, I think. So anyway, it's a great topic. It's a really needed discussion in our country, if not in the world. I don't know what it's like in other countries, but I know in the United States, domestic violence, domestic abuse is rampant. It's hidden from public many times. You don't know what people are like inside the doors of a home. Like you said, your son was told to lie about how he got hurt. I mean, that's the way that a lot of people are told when they have an abuser. And I think that we need to have churches and have believers and have things out there that are ready to reach out to us that are hurting. We had a counselor on our program named Gene Benedict. He deals with this stuff, and he's really good about this stuff. And I think it's important we see this and seek out people that can help us in the process, in the journey of healing.
Well, also, people may not realize that a lot of their churches have pastoral counseling available through lay counselors, or sometimes even people on the staff, those who feel they can't afford to go to a private counselor. And I encourage anyone to look into that. Our church does a great job with that. So. Yeah,
and there's a lot of churches out there with counseling programs, and usually there's no cost. Sometimes there is a cost. I've seen them both. But, based on your need and based on what you can afford, that's what you should seek.
And going to pastoral care, if it's beyond what they're able to help with, they do have outside resources.
Yeah. So anyway, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I know this is more of a serious topic. I hope you find light in it, especially when we talk about how there is real healing in Jesus and power in the Holy Spirit. But I want to thank you. If you have any comments or any questions, please feel free to write, ask, not necessarily call me, but you can write and ask, and I'll be glad to answer and write back to you. Everyone, you'll have a wonderful day. I want to thank Susan for joining us today. It was hard for her. She had to leave her business. But thank you for joining us, and everyone, you have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and aloha.